Hello again! And we're back for chapter 23. I think last time I said 24, but that's next. So, today we're going to continue on, keep talking about evolution, but we're going to be diving into the many parts of it. What we talked about earlier with Darwin's descent with modification became what we now know as natural selection. And like I said, we didn't really know how it worked on some ends because he didn't understand genetics at the time. And again, it's kind of a funny story in the fact that he actually had Gregor Mendel's work in his library, but never read it. And even then, maybe if he did read it, he would have been just like, meh, and kicked it out. So it's kind of an interesting thing that these two scientists working on different sides of the coin here were alive at the same time and just didn't know about each other. Or at least, I don't know if Gregor Mendel knew about Darwin, but anyway. So going back to Darwin here, here's our favorite depressed dude right here. And his wife Emma, who were first cousins. Unfortunately, the family was a whole bunch of first cousins because these two shared the exact same set of grandparents. Which actually is kind of funny because at one point he did actually look back and wondered, maybe you shouldn't marry your cousin because my children are not very robust. So, Anyway, it's crazy though. They had 10 kids, 7 of which survived to adulthood, which is just wow. So, hats off to poor Emma. Could you imagine having kids back then? Yeah. Anyway, so again, he had a very uncommon combination of symptoms. He was not exactly the healthiest individual. It's amazing he even survived as long as he did on the HMS Beagle. Because he was always getting seasick. But, and then even afterwards, again, probably because they were a bit too interrelated in his family. So it left him debilitated for long periods of time, which let him, actually work through a lot of his work in his head and think about it because he was kind of trapped in his own body. But unfortunately, it also led to him being rather depressed, which is understandable. And on top of that, overthink things, which we discussed in the last lecture, in the fact that he goes, even in ill health, though it has annihilated several years of my life, it has saved me from the distractions of society and amusement, which, like I said, was kind of a double-edged sword. Let him chew on his own thoughts for a while, work out the details of his own book and his thoughts on things, and then on top of that, unfortunately, though, overthink it completely until his BFF, Lyle, mailed him and said, stop it. So, speaking of, since then, he came up with the natural selection side of things. We also have split into two things. We've split into microevolution and macroevolution. So his, now theory connects with the population and change over time, and that's called microevolution. So things that, basically fuel microevolution are things like mutations and selection. So selection from outside things like the environment and other species in their environment. So this is survival through inheritance of favorable characteristics. Again, something we mentioned in the last lecture. Now, there's another side to this, which is macroevolution, which is the progression of diversity through geological time. So this gives us speciation and extinction. So macroevolution we will be getting into. This is finally putting in time, and keep in mind it's not always completely linear. We love to draw it like in straight lines and whatnot, and you're going to see this a lot because even Darwin himself drew phylogenetic trees, or at least the beginnings of what we then turned into phylogenetic trees. But nothing in nature is perfectly straight line. So we're going to get into that a little bit more later in this semester, but basically macroevolution can be a bit of a wee, and we're going to talk about that. So again. So let's look at the mechanisms overall of evolution. There's about 4 of them, and one we've already talked about, which is natural selection, which is basically Darwin's descent with modification, and how that worked. Again, he didn't have the genetic side of it. We do have that today, so that's why that got upheld and put into the overall span of evolution. So, other things that we're going to be talking about is genetic mutation, because mutants can either be good, bad, or mostly indifferent. We'll get into that in a minute. We've got gene flow, which is movement of populations between each other. Genetic drift, which unfortunately is usually something that happens to a population outside of their control. Like all of a sudden there's a forest fire, or, a volcano erupts. Stuff like that. Something that just goes through and kind of wipes a population down to just a few individuals, and they have to bounce back from that. Sometimes they don't. So these are 4 of the major mechanisms of evolution that are happening given all the time, every day, on life interacting on Earth. So, again, Darwin and his colleagues did not know about genetics. They had no idea how heredity worked. So, but one of the major hinge points, and he knew that there was something there, but he just didn't have the knowledge or the training really, because that wasn't his jam, that something had to have been, natural selection had to have been working on something that was already there, inherent in living beings, which is genetics. So natural selection, by the by, can only act on variation within a genetic component. Now, this is a major thing. I know it doesn't sound like it, but it's going to become major in a minute when I talk about humans misunderstanding science and going for, hey, I wonder if we can make a perfect human. Psst. If we didn't start out with perfection, we ain't going to end up with it. Evolution's never going to give us perfect, because evolution only works with what it's got, which is the genetics we've got currently on this planet. So that's going to come in a minute. So just keep in mind, this is a major thing. Natural selection can only act on variation within a genetic component. So if the genetics are there, it can act on it. If the genetics are not there, it can't invent new genetics overnight. It just can't. So it's got to work with what it's got, if that makes sense. So, however, over the next few decades, scientists integrated genetics and evolution because, again, it was that missing thing. I don't know if you've ever seen the, the South Park episode with the underwear gnomes. I know, I'm dating myself here. There was an episode where they kept losing things in the dryer, mainly underwear, even though it should have been everybody's left sock. But they went down and they found a hole behind a dryer, went down into the earth and met these gnomes. And the gnomes are like, oh yeah, we've been stealing the underwear. And they're like, why? And they go, underwear, question mark, question mark, question mark, profit. That was their 3-step business plan. And that's kind of what descent with modification was with dear Darwin, when it came with, it works. So that's when we finally figured it out. 1940s. Basically, we, looked at, genetics, 1940s into the 1950s, and then from there on in. So that became known as the modern synthesis, which is a coherent understanding of the relationship between natural selection and genetics, which took shape by the 1940s. However, that didn't come without a whole bunch of major historical not great. We'll get into that in a minute. And you'll have to forgive me, I will get on my soapbox a little bit. So this, in short, the modern synthesis describes how evolutionary processes such as natural selection can affect a population's genetic makeup, and in turn this result in the gradual evolution of populations and species. However, before I get back into genetics, this was a kind of a tumultuous time because unfortunately this understanding and the misunderstanding of modern synthesis turned into a whole pile of darkness. And that's a lot of times. Science can lead us into dark places simply because there's a lot of people that misunderstand and then run with it unchecked. And that's a major issue. And this is where I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit, because I think this is a bit of science history that everybody should know about, because I don't want it to happen again. And unfortunately, it can happen rather easily. And that is eugenics. I don't know if you've ever heard of the term eugenics, but it's basically not science masquerading as science. It's the set of beliefs and practices that aim to improve the genetic quality of a human population. In other words, basically, somebody looked at Darwin's, descent with modification, and the budding, at the time, the budding understanding, some understanding of genetics, which 1940s wasn't that hot. 1930s, it was, remember, we didn't figure out what DNA, the structure of DNA until 1950s. So, but anyway, basically it was the idea, hey, again, it went back to that misnomer of survival of the fittest. It's not survival of the fittest. It's never been survival of the fittest, because, the processes that create speciation and all this fun stuff and all the diversity on this planet is working with the genetics that we came up with in the beginning from single-celled organisms back in the primordial soup of the, baby Earth ocean. So, FYI, basically people started getting a crazy idea. What if we breed better humans? Now, this weird thought came back all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Plato. But you got to understand, our understanding of better, is there a definition for better? What is better? My better is not the same as your better. I mean, I've met people that don't like cheese, and that's totally fine, but they hate cheese, and I love cheese. So, are they wrong? No. Just means more cheese for me. But again, it's the same thing with the term better. What is better? I have thoughts where I'm standing and staring at things going, I don't like that. And, that's just the way it is. But what is better? Every generation has a different idea of better as well. Back when they had paintings and the sexy ideal was being very rotund and light-skinned at one point, because that showed you weren't outside in the fields toiling away. And then eventually in the 1930s, it flipped to being tanned and muscly. So, every so often, our ideas of beauty change. So, again, what is better? Also with the breeding of a whole bunch of animals. If you've bred, cows or cattle or horses, I was raised on a horse farm, or just look at what's happened with dogs. It's like breeding a better dog. I mean, we've got now dogs with that pushed in face, and yeah, that's cute, and it's a mark of some of the breeds, but it also leads to extreme breathing problems for that species of dog. I mean, if their face is too pushed in, they can barely breathe through their nose, which they're supposed to breathe through. So it can lead to problems when you're breeding better, or whatever is the decent look for that breed. So, sadly, when Darwin published, this re-sparked the eugenics movement again, because everybody just went, oh, see, it happens in nature, so we can just speed it up by selectively breeding humans and making a better human. Again, what is better? Who gets to decide? There's so many different, we come in so many different variations. Now, genetically speaking, having the most differences is the genetically stronger, but back then, unfortunately, and then, he published another book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animal, which his cousin read. Now, Darwin was just, doing science, but unfortunately, Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton, was not exactly on the tip of the science brain, the couple of neurons he had did not exactly equal his cousin's. So he's the one that basically sat there and said, look, my cousin wrote about, survival of the fittest, and Darwin's in the corner going, no, I didn't say that at all. No. And called for a whole bunch of eugenic policies aimed at ensuring the health of the human species. And this happened in the United States, too. This wasn't just in England. This wasn't just in Europe. So unfortunately, members of the progressive movement embraced these ideas and decided to restrict immigration and step up sterilization, whether it be voluntary, and most of the time it wasn't. So the first state to actually enact eugenics laws was Indiana in 1907. Yeah, in the grand scheme of things, yeeks. So anyway, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the laws in 1927, which I have right down here if you want to read more about it. It's insane, because we basically looked at people who had mental health conditions and said, guess what? You're not fit. So we're going to forcibly sterilize you whether you want it or not. And some of these people weren't exactly, so far out there that they didn't know what was happening to them. They knew. And it wasn't pleasant. So basically, proponents rationalized involuntary sterilization as protecting vulnerable women from unwanted pregnancy. Gee, fascinating. So, by World War II, programs in the United States had sterilized approximately 60,000 people. And, and it wasn't just us. The Nazis also got a hold of this, because this was sweet music to some of their ears, because this allowed them to get rid of all sorts of things that they were blocking them from their dream of making the perfect human, which in their opinion was the Aryan race. So, yeah, it was, they sterilized, in concentration camps. It wasn't just the Jewish, that was predominantly, but they also, anybody who was gay, anybody with mental deficiencies that they saw was deficient. Even, I believe, one of Hitler's own nieces got basically murdered. She was not, they just killed her. Instead of sterilizing them, they just killed them. So it was insane. So the German had this, the Nazi eugenics was on steroids because it was unchecked. Nobody was stopping them. So that's what led to the concentration camps. They literally had heredity health courts, and they approved 400,000 sterilization operations in less than a decade, which is. On top of that, it wasn't just sterilizing; it was straight up just murdering people. And after what came to light after World War II, what the Nazis were doing. All of a sudden the eugenic sterilization programs just went, because everybody went, oh my God, this is the end result. Holy cow. So simplistic eugenic thinking has faded, which is why a lot of people don't know the term eugenics anymore. However, it doesn't mean that it's stopped. Especially in places like China and India, involuntary sterilization is still used against minority groups to this day. This is not something that's gone away. This weird idea of let's breed a better human still hasn't gone away. It's basically one of the weapons against minorities all over the world, and it's just disgusting and something that we need to be aware of, especially going forward with laws about, getting on changing genetics and whatnot. So North Carolina didn't overturn our own eugenics laws until 2003. In the United States, there are several states that still have eugenics laws on their books, which means you could get a family member forcibly sterilized if they are mentally deficient. And what the heck is mentally deficient? That's, again, and these people are not unaware of what's happening to them. So it's insane. And back then, depression was considered in the pile of mentally deficient. So you're just depressed, so you get forcibly sterilized? Yeah, that's how crazy it is. So eugenics is a slippery slope, and that's why I bring it up. We learned our lesson, right? Apparently not, because it's still happening in several parts of the world. But on top of that, now that our understanding of genetics is changing, plus our study of epigenetics, which is basically how the environment can actually turn our genetics on and off depending on what's going on, plus we've discovered CRISPR technology, which is taking a gene, or actually it's a big protein that we can pick up out of bacteria, that bacteria use to edit their own DNA. by ripping out viral DNA that gets infected. So they go along and find, oh, that's a virus DNA, rip it out, and therefore it's kind of like their version of the immune system. But we found it and said, oh, thank you. We can edit our own DNA using this. And we have, but unfortunately, we don't want to repeat the sins of the past again with eugenics. We don't want to go, making a better human. Again, what is better? There is no definition for better. My better is not your better. You know what I mean? So, my mom, when she makes, for instance, cucumber sandwiches, her better is putting on all the mayonnaise. I hate it. I like a light scraping of mayonnaise. That's my better. Less mayonnaise, the better. But hers is more mayonnaise, and now that's soggy and ew. So you can see, it's like, and then my dad, he loved mayonnaise sandwiches. Ew. But, that's just me. I'm not a mayo fan. So again, what's better? More mayo, less mayo, or the middle part of mayo? But anyway, so, and there's a really good movie. It's old now, unfortunately. I say that because I think it's modern, but that's probably because I'm stuck in the 80s and the 90s. Mentally, somehow. Anyway, but long story short, the movie Gattaca kind of looks at this. It follows along a guy that was not genetically altered at birth because his parents were in this naturalist movement, which is fine and good. But in that future, the human race is very much stratified over, those that have genetic, had genetic tampering when they were kids versus genetic tampering or not. And those that don't live on the lower rungs, and those that do live in the upper echelon, and because they, are not going to get sick and all that stuff, and they can go into space. And the main character wants to go into space, and he's not genetically modified. So it's a whole movie about him tricking the system, breaking the system, and trying to get it to go into space. I'm not going to say it more than that, but highly recommend if you haven't watched it. It's food for thought. It's kind of a slow movie. It's not exactly action-packed. So if you're feeling a down night and you want kind of a slowish movie, Gattaca's pretty good. So anyway, do we want to get, and that brings up, it's like, we have a lot of genetic diseases, like, Alzheimer's, which is pretty much genetic, but things like, Lou Gehrig's disease. I have a former coworker, love her to pieces, but her son has Lou Gehrig's disease, and he's, unfortunately, it's just insane to watch what's happening to this guy. And would I love to get rid of it genetically? Yes. We don't need that in the population. Huntington's disease. Oh God, Tay-Sachs. I can name so many, and you probably could too, because you probably have ones that are in your family that you'd probably be like, I'd like to see this never take place to even my enemy. Yeah. But after that, should we continue tampering? Should we continue making a better human? Again, should we go in there and mess with autistic people, or ADHD and fix that? It's like, there's some that are kind of like, there's a lot of us that have it, and it's like, do we need to be fixed? And there's a slippery slope again. And that's why I brought up eugenics, and that's why I bring up this. This is why it's important to study biology, it's important to study science, and it's important to listen to people who actually have a strong understanding of what they're talking about when it comes to a lot of these concepts, so we don't get the survival of the fittest, and we came from monkeys, because we didn't. I despise monkeys. Anyway, but long story short, with cheese, yeah, this is basically, why I get on my soapbox a bit about this, because I feel this is a very important thing to say. Yes, this led to dark places in science, and this was an undercurrent that was fueling what became World War II. Now, there was other things as well, but this was definitely in there, was in the mix. So I would hate to see, a genetic World War III with that in the mix. I'm just saying, a lot of also certain billionaires, I wouldn't name names, but I could, seem to unfortunately hold on to this technology will save us and make utopias in the future. It hasn't. I mean, if you remember the 1950s ideal of looking at the future and going, oh yes, in the future we'll have kitchens that cook for us and blah blah blah. And floating cars and no pollution, and we're still, hello, it's 2025 and we still haven't gotten it. So what we think of this idyllic future may not come about, just like the idyllic future of the 1950s hasn't come about. So just food for thought. So anyway, getting back to genetics. So, in kind of a proper way, remember, genetic variation refers to all the differences in genes and other DNA sequences among individuals. And remember, a whole bunch of individuals make up a population. So, phenotype is the product of inherited genotype and environmental influences. This is where epigenetics comes in. Because there are things that, when you're born, and even during life right now, the environment can be hitting you in such a way that it's actually turning on and off certain genes. And we've actually been studying that more and more and more, and it's actually really, really interesting if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But anyway, phenotypic differences determined by a single gene can usually be classified with an either-or basis. And this is basically what Mendel figured out with peas, like pea flowers can either be purple or white. There's no in between. But then after that, we learned about, independent, not independent. We learned about codominance and, with the ABO blood types and whatnot. And we learned with, incomplete dominance where it mixes. So just FYI, yeah, it can be either or, but half the time, especially in mammals, it's not. It's really rare to find Mendelian genetics in mammals. The only couple of things that we have that isn't, genetic disease related for humans is our earwax. Yeah, Mendelian genetics works on earwax. If you have dry earwax or you can have wet earwax, there's no in between. I've got wet, by the way, if you wanted to know. And it's annoying. Anyway, so phenotypic differences determined by two or more genes usually vary in graduations along a continuum. So example, coat color in horses. This is how we get those blended traits. Or height in humans. This is why, a person who's short and a person who's tall have a kid, and they could have a kid that's kind of in the middle. Or the kid can betray the short person and be tall too. And then the short person is sitting there going, really? Anyway, which is probably going to happen with my son when he towers over me, because all the guys in my family are 6-something, and then I married a guy that's 6-something, and now my son's probably going to be 6-something, and I'm going to be stuck here at 5'6", going, yeah, why is everybody so tall? Anyway, so again, so remember, hopefully you covered this in 111, but remember the genetic variation qualified by the percentage of heterozygous loci in a population. So molecular level genetic variation is quantified by comparing nucleotide sequences between two or more individuals. And it's crazy just how related we all are. Pretty much all humans are pretty much 100% related to each other. Genetic level, if we're looking at all genes that you're carrying, it's only like a tenth of a percentage that's off between families. That's just how wacky related we are all. Which is why the Maury Poviches, when you're like, you are the father, you should see the percentages we have to put in on those reports. It's pretty intense. So anyway, so nucleotide variability rarely results in phenotypic variation. Because everybody's got pretty much the same thing, we don't get a lot of in-betweening. New things only pop up when we get mutations. That's basically what I'm trying to get at right here, is most nucleotide differences occur within the non-coding segments, which are those introns. And they're not junk DNA, they're just stuff we're not using right now. I mean, we've got a ton of DNA, it's not junk, we've used it at some point, it's just we're not using it right now. It's kind of like me and my art supplies. Sometimes I'm in the middle of art supplies and I'm using beads. I have paint, but I'm not using the paint. And I might not use the paint for another 4 months. Who knows? I might just be sitting there collecting dust for another 1.5 years. But eventually I'll pull the paint back out. That's kind of like the difference between introns and exons, is the exons are expressed, introns are not. So introns are the introverts, exons are the extroverts. The exons get expressed, they get turned into coding sequences, and they're used all the time because we need them all the time, making things like, for insulin or, any other, dopamine or any other chemical in our protein in our body that we need to run our body. We're constantly making those. Those would be the exons. The introns are kind of like, we'll pull them out once in a while if we need them or not. But other than that, that basically is the things that get used all the time across the board, across the population. Like I said, one of the things we all use, melatonin, we're always making, except for us pasty people. We make melatonin, we just don't make as much as some other people. But that's made across the board, across all humans. We pump out melatonin, just in variations. But, in other proteins, we might not use it that much. So it depends. So how do you get it to change then? Well, that's where mutations come in. And that, remember, mutations usually are, basically sequences that get changed. And it's usually either a typo or something gets flipped or, and basically genetic variation arises when new genes and alleles basically happen through gene duplicate, other processes. Mutation happens to us all the time. And we have a lot of parts of our body that actually go through and fix the mutations in our DNA. But even those fixes aren't perfect either. And hopefully you talked about some of those in 111. But because of this, these variations are produced rapidly in organisms in short generation times. Sometimes that can be given to a next generation. So sexual reproduction can produce genetic variation by recombining existing alleles with those little mutations. So not only is the shuffling between, two different parents gives it a new rise to the next generation that has, a little bit different than everybody else because we got two people from two different populations, or you got mutations. Now, most mutations usually don't do anything. Most mutations either get fixed, chopped out, or whatnot. It's very rare for it to move down to, the next generation, especially if it happens in somatic cells and not and not in other things. So again, some mutations alter an individual's fitness, some do not, and some turn into cancer eventually, which is not good. So, mutations have a chance, but that tiny, tiny, tiny chance can affect everything else. It's kind of like a butterfly effect. If it goes in the right direction. It doesn't always, because it's random. So anyway, cause of most is usually gene shuffling. This is due to meiosis, remember, crossing over. Sometimes when you're going through meiosis and you're making your eggs and your sperm, the chromosomes will touch, and then because DNA is sticky, it builds a bridge and then switches, and that makes it even more random. And more random means more diversity, which means healthier. Remember, diversity is good, genetically speaking. Diversity is good. So anyway, I think diversity is good all the way around, but still, genetically, if we're looking at just biology, diversity is good. So, because of this, can give us some random things happening and shuffles up the monotony a bit. So between mutations and gene shuffling, we get diversity. And that's a good thing. And that leads to changes in DNA that otherwise wouldn't be changing. So again, natural selection brings about adaptive evolution by acting on a phenotype. So remember, that's what the DNA has expressed. Our phenotype is like what you see, physical things like my hair color, my eye color, my skin color, stuff like that. It's stuff that, is basically what we're running on all the day. So the phrases like I said earlier, struggle for existence or survival of the fittest, are completely misleading because they imply direct competition among individuals. And that's not always the case, especially in a social species like ourselves. We're not competing with each other going, ha-ha, to get mates. Sometimes, you got a wingman helping you land some chicks, you know what I'm saying? We actually help each other. In a true survival of the fittest, we wouldn't care about, other people's young kids, or we wouldn't care about the elderly at all. We're very social. We like helping each other. We get, a lot of our social tenets are, help each other, because that's how we survive as a whole. So survival of the fittest is a complete and utter misnomer for a lot of the species that are on this planet, because a lot of them work together, and it's very rare to get against each other except in certain areas. So reproductive success is very much more subtle than survival of the fittest. So that's another reason why survival of the fittest is bunk. Example, a barnacle that's more efficient at food collection than the others, of course, will have more energy to make more babies. And that's relative fitness. And that's an actual thing, not survival of the fitness, relative fitness. Because in the name of the game, biology, how you win is getting your genes into the future generations. If you get your genes into the future generations, you win biologically. But that does not necessarily mean, it's just you. It could be your family and whatnot. So relative fitness is the contribution an individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation relative to the contributions of other individuals. And like I said, there's a lot of species, including us on this planet, that like to help each other do that. It's not just a either or kind of thing. So relative fitness is a thing, but it's not the same thing as survival of the fittest. Now, again, mutation, we talked about that. Again, we also have another thing on non-random mating versus assortative mating. This basically is another thing that impacts. Again, we all have our preferences. I like guys with long hair. And hey, look, I'm married to one. He's smiling at me right now. Anyway, that's a thing. But we actually see that in other species too. It's like you've got your preferences, I've got my preferences. And we usually gravitate towards the we like, and it's different for everybody. So, some individuals seek out mates with a certain trait, like manes and lions. And we actually found this out, that it's interesting because once again, Disney has lied to us. In The Lion King. It's interesting because in certain groups of lions, a darker mane is considered sexier, basically. They look at the dark mane and go, oh, he is lion-y. I don't think they go, he's manly, because they're lions. I don't know. So the lionesses go, yeah, look at that dark, luxurious mane. Oh, I wouldn't have kittens with him. Anyway, don't know if that's what they're thinking. But anyway, But basically, we have done that. We did a study with this one band of lions where we actually took lions with lighter colored manes and we put wigs on them. I'm not kidding you. We went out, we put them to sleep for a while, went out and put a wig on them and ran away. So we actually stuck a darker wig, and all of a sudden they got more honeys. And it was true. And then we took the wig off and all the ladies were like, ew, and left. So it was, this was serious science here. So it just shows that in all species, we're always looking for different things. I mean, heck, let's look at all the birds, look at all the birds with their beautiful colors and their crazy dances and everything like that. And the females go, yeah, your timing is so off. I am not making eggs with you. Or, some of them are just, they're singing and they sing and they sing and they sing. And the birds actually select. And we actually used to stick probes into their brains so we could put it on a computer to figure out what certain songs made certain females go, yeah, I like what he's singing, man. So that way there's not one bird going, hey, here's Wonderwall. Anyway, if you got that joke, you're my age. Anyway, so again, this is an example of sexual selection. Sometimes it results in sexual dimorphism, where the male and the female look very different, like in birds. And like I said, Lion King lied to us, because if it was true, Scar should be king because he had a beautiful, luxurious black mane, and all the lionesses would have found him hot. Yes. Anyway. And not so much Simba and, oh shoot, what's his name? What's the dad's name? Mufasa! Anyway, sorry, that took me a minute. Anyway, and another one is environmental variance. So when people from cities are usually fair-skinned because we don't get out, the sun's all been blocked by all the buildings and whatnot, versus rural areas where we get more tan. So there's that too. It's like some people like, lighter skin, and some people like darker skin, and it's all good whether you like the light meat or the dark meat. It's all good. So anyway, again, how does this affect a population? Well, it can change depending on what's going on. For instance, it can have directional selection. So in other words, it forces a population over time to shift So for one extreme chain against the other extreme. So you got short tails versus long tails. And basically the long tails are selected for more, and it shifts from the short tail, and it literally shifts over time. Now keep in mind, this is over generations, to where these lizards have longer tails, longer and longer and longer tails, and it shifts the whole population on a graph over. That's called directional selection. So, for instance, why, some lions prefer that black mane. You'd see more and more lions being born with that black mane than not, because they're selecting for that in the population. Now, stabilizing selection is basically where both traits, both extremes, are bad. For instance, you ever wonder why cats don't have insanely long tails, or in some cases short tails? And usually it's because they use their tails as a counterbalance. Snow leopards do too, but they also use it to wrap their little noses and protect it in the snow. They're very fluffy. But anyway, so long story short, in tigers, for instance, long tails mess up their balance for jumping around. Short tails don't give them as much balance. So therefore, these medium tails are perfect. And therefore, it selects against short and long. And again, this extreme changes, and you get in between. Now, it can do the opposite of stabilizing, which is known as disruptive. So moderate traits are bad, for instance, and this is also where you can get a bit of speciation popping up, because this disruptive selection could go whoosh and split right in two, where there's one population that the short tails help keep predators from catching them on the ground because they're on the ground 24/7, but the ones up in, these squirrels that live up in the trees, they need that long tail to help them keep balance and make their ridiculously long jumps to keep them stable when they do that. So therefore, both extremes are basically selected for, and it's against the moderate traits. Now, like I said, disruptive selection eventually can split, and then you can have two separate species of ground squirrels with short tails and squirrels in trees with very long tails. So this is how selection can change a population given enough time. And like I said, again, this isn't survival of the fittest. None of this. It's literally how the species is selecting for that, whether it be, just the birds going, yeah, I like him better because he dances way better than everybody else, versus, survival of surviving predators, or making it so they can move faster across the ground and all that fun jazz. So again, this is how selection affects a population. He'll go into this too, and he talks about some moths, because we've seen this go back and forth, so please do go watch that. Skip. All right, now let's get into, I've mentioned this before, what is a species? So a species is a group of individual organisms that interbreed and produce fertile, viable offspring, which means they too can get together and have kids. For example of this is domesticated dogs. They can interbreed and make offspring that are fertile. However, for instance, a good example of the opposite of this is horses and donkeys. When they breed, they make infertile mules, which means the only way you can get more mules is by breeding more horses and donkeys. Mules are infertile. You can't get a mule and make more mule babies. That's just not how it works. Horses and donkeys have split so far on their separate tracks, speciation tracks, that they can still get together and make babies. The babies can't make. So mules are not a species. They just can't, because they're not fertile, and they cannot make viable offspring. So mules are not a species. So, and we hit this a lot, like ligers. Of course, that only happens if we do it in a lab. Making a tiger and a lion hybrid, that only happens in the lab. We can only force that in the lab. We can't do that in nature. Lions and tigers beat the poo out of each other for the most part. We've had a few where we've put them together in zoos because they're both lonely. And I was watching a video earlier with this one lion, because lions are extremely social, whereas tigers are very solitary. And it was hysterical because they put this male lion in with a male tiger, and the two of them are BFFs, but the lion is like lovey-dovey on the tiger, and the tiger's like, please, dude, I love you, but oh god, get off me. It's like the Odd Couple, except in cats. Anyway, so now what does that mean? So a population is a group of interbreeding organisms that are members of the same species. So remember, Organisms that are all members of the same species are called conspecifics. So basically, if all the humans around the world, we are all conspecifics because we're all humans. A population is identified in part where it lives, and its area of population may have natural or artificial boundaries, like, say, everybody living on an island somewhere or something like that. Or, it'd be just small town stuff. You know how everybody knows everybody in a small town until somebody moves away or somebody new moves in, and then you're like, oh, yeah, that's a population there too, because, some people stay in their same small town for the rest of their lives, and some people move away and some people come back. It's just the way it is. So we can characterize a population's genetic makeup by describing its gene pool, which consists of all copies of every type of allele of every locust in the members of a population. So if somebody did genetic testing on everybody in Hendersonville and found out, all the genes that everybody's carrying in Hendersonville, and we would call that Hendersonville's gene pool, not to be confused with Patton Park. Anyway, so all these factors come together to form the basis of the study of population genetics, which is how selective forces change a population through the change in alleles and genotypic frequencies. This is where we're now moving into macroevolution. So bringing it back to there. So allele frequency or gene frequency is the rate at which a specific allele appears within a population. Like, for instance, brown eyes. Most of us in Hendersonville have brown eyes. You blue-eyed people and you green-eyed people, you're mutants, you crazy mutants, you. But, for the most part, we all have varying colors of brown eyes. It's kind of a dominant trait among humans. Not as in, genetically, but as in, for instance, just numer-wise. So anyway, the gene pool is the sum of all the alleles in a population, as I said earlier. Now, again, he gets into this, and I highly recommend this one. And I hopefully turned it into something you have to watch, because he's going to get into Hardy-Weinberg, which is going to be kind of important in a minute. And there's this thing called the
Hey, look.
the Hardy-Weinberg equation. So once upon a time, there was a British mathematician and a German physician, and they both came up with the same equation at the same time about how populations don't change. And you might be going, wait, whoa. Why would you want an equation about a population not changing? I thought you were the whole point of you talking about this was because we're talking about how populations change. Yes, but the cool thing about this equation is the fact that it acts like a control group in an experiment. It basically tells us if everything is zero in a population, that means no changes are happening, and that does not happen in the natural world. So if you get a Hardy-Weinberg equation and you plug in the numbers and you do the math and it comes out to zero, something's wrong and you need to go back and check out what's up, because that means the population isn't changing. And we know populations change all the time, every which way, whether it be human or all the animals or plants or anything. On this planet, things be changing all the time. It's nature. So it shows the math of a population that doesn't change, so we can compare it to real life numbers and figure out where the change is. That's why we have it. It's our control group to see if population change is happening, and if it is, where is it happening? So that's why we need the Hardy-Weinberg equation. So it's observing the genetic makeup of a population differs from the expectations under Hardy-Weinberg, then your population is probably evolving. So that's why we have an equation that equals zero. So again, we have assumptions about Hardy-Weinberg, and he has 5 of them. And that is, there's no mutation, which in real life is almost impossible. No random mating, opposite words. Random mating, in other words, there's no choice. You just say, oh, hi, let us make a baby, randomly. No gene flow, which means nobody's moving in and out of a population. No infinite population size, which means the population is set at a certain number, and that's it. And deaths equals births, period. And then no natural selection. So, descent with modification, things acting, things eating us and all that fun jazz, and predators, they don't exist. All that stuff doesn't exist. So, no mutation, random mating. In other words, there's no choice. You just meet up with a dude, or if you're a girl, or if you're a guy, meet up with a girl or whatever. no gene flow, no moving. Infinite population size means you have everything you ever need, and no natural selection. So what this means is there's two alleles. You got the dominant. Remember, we had dominant and recessive, so we're going back to Mendelian genetics, because this is what they had to work with, both Hardy and they looked at the Mendelian genetics when it came out and went, I can do some math. And this is the math they came up with. So the frequency of the dominant allele and the frequency of the recessive allele, if you add them together, they should always equal 1. If they don't equal 1, that means evolution is happening. Now, if there's only two alleles, you got the frequency of the dominant, you got the frequency of the heterozygous, because remember, you got homozygous, so you got, big P, and then big P, and then little p. Remember that whole fun with the Punnett squares and all that junk? Yeah, this is what it's playing off of. So if you got 2PQ, that's the heterozygous, the people that have the hetero. So this is the homozygous dominant, heterozygous, homozygous recessive. So again, people who are purple, but that's because they have big P. People who are purple because they're big P, and the little p, of course, is hiding. And then people who are pink, which is little p. Or in this case, they use Q, which makes more sense. Thank you. But if you put those numbers in, again, it equals to 1. If the Hardy-Weinberg is happening, and again, these 5 things are holding true, and it equals, the numbers come out to 1, your population is not evolving. Like I said, in real life, that doesn't happen. But if you do this in real life, you take a population and you do these numbers and it comes out to something other than 1, congratulations, your population is definitely evolving because it doesn't match the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which is a good thing. So we use the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium to basically figure out, is something happening? And if so, what is it? So again, here's another one really good with the Amoeba Sisters. So if you're having a hard time wrapping your brain around it, she does a really good job of explaining with Frugs. So please definitely watch with the Frugs. I have it listed. Yep. Anyway, now, that's all genetics. So let's get into some other things. Like I said, what became natural selection for Darwin held up, especially when we added genetics in and went, oh, that's the missing bit. But now let's talk about some other things. For instance, genetic drift. So this, in each generation, some individuals may, just by chance, leave behind a few more descendants, and because of that, their genes, than other individuals. These are not necessarily better individuals. It's like, they just put either the new movie or a remake of, Final Destination out, the movie? Yeah, it's like that. People can die randomly of random things, and it happens. It's sad, and it's horrible, but because they've just randomly died of whatever, they got sick and died, or, like, for instance, this is so sad. I had a former coworker who, his mother was just happening to drive to work one morning, and a tree fell on her truck and killed her. I mean, we were all stunned. It's just, ugh. And that is an example, unfortunately, of genetic drift, because, granted, she wasn't going to have any more kids, but still, I mean, that's why it's sad sometimes when we have to see somebody, young pass away, and it's because you're like, oh, they're missing out on their entire future. On a biology level, it's worse because their genetics are not going to go into the future. So that, in a nutshell, is genetic drift. It happens to all populations. It's according to chance. Has nothing to do with being fitter or better or anything like that. It's just, poop, one day you're there, and next you're gone, and you don't have kids, and therefore your genetics aren't going to go into the next generation. And some people live longer, like Ramses, who had lots of kids. And, take Genghis Khan. He had lots of kids, and his genetics definitely went into the future, which is why now, most of the Mongolian population can at least go back to one of his descendants genetically. So he was a big genetic drift winner. Again, it wasn't because he was fitter or anything like that. It's just everything worked out that he had a ton of kids, and his sons and his daughters had a ton of kids, and then so on and so forth. So they won the genetic drift. This is also natural disasters. Natural disasters happen, and that can literally wipe out a population, which can lead to the genetic bottleneck, which is really big bad. So sometimes, genetic drift happens on such a huge scale where, let's look at Pompeii. Vesuvius went boom, and, pretty much Pompeii and anyway, and now I can't think of it. Anyway, I want to say Hellenistic, but that's a time period. Anyway, long story short, but basically 2 cities got raffle stomped, and that happens. Herculaneum, thank you. My husband came and saved me. Herculaneum. I was thinking the complete wrong thing. But basically, they got completely wiped off the map, all ages, because, again, and it sometimes can hit a population and reduce a population to the point where there's only a few survivors. And those few survivors, it creates a genetic bottleneck, which is dangerous because it results in inbreeding, whether they mean it or not. So imagine you have a population filled with all these wonderful genetic diversity and all this, but then only a couple of individuals survive, and they have to restart the population. And restarting from just a couple of alleles makes everybody pretty much genetically the same, which means you're really genetically vulnerable to things like viruses and getting sick on certain levels. And makes us all have the same weaknesses. So it's not good. Remember, genetic diversity is good. And sometimes if it's too much of a bottleneck event, it can lead us straight into extinction. Now, sometimes a species can recover from that and bounce back, and then allow the mutations and other things to pop up to help it over time. But right now, one of the species that's a good example of a population bottleneck are cheetah. The reason cheetah is because they get picked on by pretty much both lions and hyenas. There's kind of like turf wars, gang wars in the natural world, and one of the major ones in Africa is between lions and hyenas. They hate each other. Like, they'll go out of their way, no reason, not threatening their territory, not doing anything, but they'll go out of their way just to pick each other off. Just straight up, no. There's a lone lion out doing something and he's not with his pride or whatnot, or she's not with her pride, and the hyenas see her and it isn't even near the hyena's territory. They don't care. They'll go after and kill her. Same thing, the reverse is true there, but they both hate cheetahs. So they'll both pick off and kill cheetahs. And unfortunately, cheetahs have, due to this and also hunting from humans, they've bottlenecked. And all cheetahs right now are extremely related to each other. Now, sometimes we can bring a species back through selective breeding programs, and that's why we have a lot of zoos, because they have selective breeding programs. And that's usually the big zoos, not the mom and pops by the side, not Tiger King. Thank you. I can get so started on that. Being a former zoo person myself, I've got some stories, but I'm not going to tell them now. But anyway, ask me later. Anyway, the bottlenecking can happen. It's not a good thing. So yeah, sometimes bottlenecking, a major event outside of our control, can decimate the population down to a bottleneck, and depending on how it's handled, some species can bounce back, and some species just go extinct. So, gene flow, also called migration. So this is basically the movement of genes from one population to another. Gene flow includes lots of different kind of events, like pollen being blown around, which makes all of us so happy with the allergies, or people just moving to new cities, and sometimes en masse. Like, let's go back and look at, Hurricane Katrina. A lot of people got relocated because of the horrific thing of just poor Louisiana, parts of Florida, parts of Georgia. I mean, it got destroyed. And a lot of people picked up and moved because they had no choice. Everything they owned was gone. So they moved with families in Texas. Or we had several people that moved up here in North Carolina afterwards. It spread the population out that normally wouldn't have been moved if it hadn't have been for the destruction, and that's gene flow. So basically, if there's a war in one part of the country and we take in immigrants, that's gene flow. We're getting new genes from another population coming in, and that's kind of why America's a melting pot. We've always been called the melting pot because we don't mind the gene flow coming in. So we get these genes carried into a population where they did not exist. And this flow is really important because it gives us a source of genetic variation. So the more populations move around, the more genetically diverse they get. And again, remember, biology diversity for the win. So more genetic variation means we're more robust genetically, which means if like a virus pops up, it may kill some of us, but some of us are, genetically robust to resist and move on, which is something that definitely happened in the Black Plague. So it was, that was a major, speaking of genetic bottlenecks. Anyway, we're all the descendants of the survivors of the Black Plague, because the ones that didn't have kids to go into the future. So we can all get t-shirts that say, descendant of Black Plague survivor, if you want something metal like that. Now, founder effect. So, for instance, sometimes it's like, who's played Animal Crossing? So sometimes it's time to start over on a new island. So sometimes we get something called the founder effect, which basically occurs when a few individuals become isolated from a larger population. So the allele frequencies in the smaller population differ from those in the parent population because there's only a few people that move off. And this happens sometimes, like, for instance, some insects are being blown to a new island by a storm. Or, somebody goes off and says, I hate this town. Me and my family are moving into the mountains and we're going to make our own commune. So, And that's happened too. We've had that several times here in America where that's happened, and now we have a town of truly people who are related to each other. That's happened quite a few times. We even got the blue people of Tennessee out of it. Basically, there were some people that actually have a genetic dysfunction to where their skin is blue, and they kind of got kicked out, moved away because of the ridicule, and over time, that family turned into its own little population, and two kids popped out of the woods one day into a bigger because they needed help for something, and they were blue. And the doctors basically, looked at them, said, that's interesting, went over and found the rest of the family, and it was interesting because after that we discovered why they were blue. And we injected them with a protein that their bodies were not making, and suddenly they turned normal color. So if you want to look up, I think it's the blue people of Kentucky or Tennessee. I think I have it on the next slide. But anyway, and this brings me to this. Again, why can natural selection cannot fashion perfect organisms? Because selection can only act on what existing variations there is. If you don't start with perfect, you ain't going to get perfect. It's just the limitations of how we started, how we've come about. Evolution is limited by historical constraints. Again, all this stuff kind of happened a little bit haphazardly, kind of. And because of this, there's no such thing as perfect. And if you don't have perfect to start with, you ain't going to get perfect at the end result. So selection can only take existing variations of what we've got, none of which are perfect. Trust me. I can complain about how the chemistry behind photosynthesis isn't terribly perfect, but, plants are like, it doesn't work, why fix it? Nature's a lot like that. It's like, well, it works, don't fix it. We could make better, but nobody's got the time, and it works. Same thing. Adaptations often are compromises. A lot of times, a lot of adaptations are compromises between two different types so we can survive. In other words, like sickle cell anemia. And one end, if you're fully healthy, back then, malaria would kill you if you had fully perfect red blood cells. But if you have pure sickle cell anemia, all of your red blood cells look like sickles and they can't carry oxygen and you die. But if you're heterozygous for sickle cell anemia, which means you've got big round red blood cells and the sickle cell type that barely work, but you will live through malaria. Malaria will not kill you because malaria cannot figure out what those sickle cells are. They're like, what are those? So that way, you'd live through malaria, but you might die of a clot because those sickle cells love to clot. So that's why adaptations are often compromises between the two variations that will kill you and the medium that's kind of like, Oh, again, that's why we can't get perfect. It's usually a compromise. So, one end is dying of malaria, the other end is dying of just straight sickle cells because you have nothing but sickle cells, and the middle part is not great, but it's so you don't die. That's where sickle cell anemia came from, literally. Chance, natural selection, and the environment also interact. Like I said earlier, genetic drift literally is, chance. The volcano can pop its top tomorrow. California can shake itself off into an island. Actually, it wouldn't work that way. But still, you know what I'm saying. All the mountains they call mountains out west, which are actually volcanoes, could all go pfft. And then, then Chicago's under a dust cloud forever, and that, screws up the agriculture in the middle of the, a lot of things can go wrong randomly, and we have nothing to do with it. And because of that, that influences population genetics too, and survival of a lot of different species. So, sorry, we're never going to get gigachads. All that, and don't get me started on the alpha, sigma, and beta nonsense. Anyway, so there you go. Can nature ever get it perfect? No. And the same thing, yeah, we could go in and we could genetically create, maybe in the future, somebody who's perfect. But again, it goes back to what is perfect. Every generation's definition of perfect changes over time. So there's never going to be a perfect human because we can never agree on what the freak perfect is. So it's kind of like, pizza toppings. Nobody can agree on the pizza toppings. If we can't even agree on that, we should stay out of the human stuff. So again, here's some other videos with genetic drift and how that works. And pause. But anyway, so that's basically what's going on. That's chapter 3 in a nutshell. I hope that's been enlightening to you. And I'm sorry these videos have come out so late. I've been having major technical difficulties on top of other things. So thank you so much for waiting. And I'll see you next week with the next couple of chapters. So take it easy. And like usual, if you have any questions, shoot me a line. Have a good one.